Let's get oral.
Hey, let's get oral today. This mouth is on fire. Woo! Inflammation, let's go.
I love it. I'm so glad you did the Alicia Keys intro, because I'm sure you would have probably got like a cease and desist if I did it.
I don't know. I'm not that, well, I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. It could still happen.
Let's get oral.
So I'm just going to prepare the pod and say, Jonathan, lucky SOB today is in Hawaii. And so
Yes.
It's early enough that it's still dark over there and the sun is coming up. And so we expect to hear some roosters shortly. We'll see how this goes. But really, let's get into inflammation before those roosters come alive. Oh no, I've lost you. Can you come back? I'm back.
Sorry about that, everyone. It's I'm on Hawaii time, as Camille said.
Island time,
And
yes.
Island time is quite nice. But another thing that is nice is not having a mouth on fire.
Yeah,
And let me tell you, inflammation is, we've all experienced it in one way, shape, or form. But there's a particular group of us when it comes to the mouth that experience it in a wide spectrum of ways, whether it's from an acute injury, such as burning your tongue with hot coffee, like I did yesterday morning.
Oh, yeah, you were a cone of coffee, weren't you?
Oh,
Ugh.
Exactly. I got
Delicious.
way too excited because it just smelled so good. So I just put it to my mouth, and next thing you know, my mouth was on fire.
Oh, God.
And then there's others on the more extreme side of that spectrum who more or less perpetually do feel burning and uncomfortable pain sensations in their mouth. And the common link to the mechanisms after experiencing that pain is this thing we call inflammation. So
Ooh. Inflammation
I
gets
know.
a big rap for just about everything in our bodies. Stress can induce inflammation. And then anytime you have an inflammatory moment, it could be exacerbated by, it seems like anything.
yes. Yes.
How does it propagate to the degree that just affects our whole body?
Right. And, that's really the theme and story we want to explore and share with you all today. For the record, I do want to say, because Camille did highlight that, inflammation itself is generally a defensive response. So it's not inherently a bad thing. It's something that allows us to be able to live healthy lives under normal conditions. However, there are cases where that's not the case, whether it's due to genetics or systemic diseases that perpetuate that response in excess or not enough. But let's start at the beginning.
Well, I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say, I do appreciate genetics just because we've learned so much from deficiencies, and I feel for these people, but wow, they've been really beneficial to better understand how our bodies are working and how these inflammatory processes develop.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the first thing we should probably do is generally just define inflammation and kind of give a quick overview and what that process looks like. And then we can get a bit nerdy about the genetics and everything else.
All right, give it to us.
All right. So let's start at the top. When it comes to that initial injury or insult, I will probably switch between using those two terms. But inflammation usually is initiated when there's some form of physical or chemical agent or a substance that causes an injury in a local space in your tissue. So we usually experience that like you get a mosquito bite or cut your finger, or in my case, like biting my tongue from eating a really good Hawaiian barbecue and poke.
Ah, you're killing me.
Sorry, I promise that's the last one, guys.
I'm just sitting here in the rural heart of Jersey. No big deal. Go on.
And once that injury takes place, you generally have a relatively quick response that's characterized by your hallmark forms of pain. You might feel some warmth or heat at that site of injury. Sometimes you'll experience itching, and then usually also swelling and some combination of redness. And so I think we've all experienced that in some way, shape, or form throughout our lives. What I don't think is discussed enough at times, though, is when we talk about the role our microbes or the bacteria and fungi and whatnot play a role in that process. Because when you do introduce, say, or like when you do have a injury that breaks, say, your skin barrier by a nail, usually that nail is not sterile. Therefore, it will tend to have microbes present that could potentially be invasive. And so the human body has evolved this amazing immune system that is at this point called the innate immunity, where the signals and the chemicals from the damaged cells found at that site of injury, and in addition to sometimes chemicals or signals released by those invading pathogens, signal locally to the surveilling immune cells that, hey, our barrier or our fences, our border, however you want to phrase it, has been broken, and we need to check it out. And this is where your phagocytes, such as macrophages, will come along.
Say neutrophils. Say it. Say neutrophils.
Neutrophils. I will say it. I was going to say the neutrophils for you.
Neutrophils.
I'll say it. These neutrophils will come through, and they'll be able to both directly and indirectly sense and detect these invasive pathogens at the site of injury, and they can start doing the initial cleanup. And so this is where the swelling, that itchiness and redness is usually derived from, because in addition to these neutrophils being able to eat up and gobble the mess at the site of injury, they also are able to release these chemical signals called cytokines that also help to start the wound or injury healing process. Now, beyond the initial site of injury, we do also have other immune cells that play part in this system downstream. But before they can get to the site of injury, they have to also know that there is an injury to take place.
Well, one of the things I wanted to interject here, so you're talking about like a wound, skin barrier function, but I also wanted to kind of broaden the conversation, since we will kind of get into the systemic conversation as well. Like what you're speaking on is a pathogen localized, and what a virus is typically more broad and general through the vasculature, and creates an insult kind of more globally. And so while you can have a lot of the same processes occurring in the vasculature that you would see locally too, this can, give a whole different feeling to the illness, where you have all of these cytokines that you're talking about, these inflammatory components to initiate that immune, initiation to get that pathogen sequestered and isolated so that the body can deal with it, right?
Absolutely.
But then what happens? Is there a wound repair? Let's talk wound repair. What does that look like?
Right. And so wound repairs is now when the immune cells and the tissues start to be able to, once the cleanup is beginning, they want to be able to force out as much as the bad stuff. And so that's with swelling, the bleeding, the closing off, and just the concentration of neutrophils and macrophages and dead cells that create
Platelets
what y'all
and-
probably recognize as pus. that white gross stuff. So as disgusting as that might seem to most of us, it's a good sign, I promise. That means
Healing,
that the
yes.
body is healing. It is doing what it needs to do to prevent further injury at that site or that place of origin. Now, what happens when you have, let's say, an immune system that is systemically proactive or hyperactive, which meaning it's perpetually being on or too active, or hypoactive, being not active enough? This is where you have immunodeficiency disorders that seem to be attacking the body of site in an uncontrolled way. And these conditions, I think some of us are familiar with colloquially, such as rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, type 1 diabetes, and there's a long list we could go through that tackle different tissues like the pancreas and your joints and whatnot. But systemically, once the body is unable to control that inflammatory response, that could really debilitate people's livelihood and well-being. And so now you have to be dependent on either other forms of therapy and or genetic therapy and whatnot to be able to have some sort of relief accordingly.
Yes.
How does that? What would you like to add to that?
The genetic component. Well, so you have this globalized inflammatory response that could potentially lead to kind of autoimmune disorders if that immune or inflammatory event isn't handled correctly. It can kind of propagate and isn't always reliant on genetics necessarily, but can kind of run rampant. And there are a lot of factors for how that is determined and frankly, what we understand scientifically. So I think that's a huge open space that we are actively pursuing. And I think that there's some really good evidence for trained immunity, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Absolutely. Another example of a systemic form of inflammation linked to genetics, I think we've talked about in the past, is leukocyte adhesion deficiency, where your B and T cells lack essentially a cell surface adhesion or molecule that allows it to migrate and become localized at that site or the place that body because become harmed. Therefore, if due to the lack of having that adhesion due to the genetic background or the allele present in that individual, that gives them a disadvantage from the get-go that could be passed on throughout different generations and familially.
I do love the leukocyte adhesion deficiency issue because we've learned so much for periodontal health and disease from this population of individuals. Nikki from the NIH has done a lot of research in this area, kind of underscoring the importance of neutrophils in the tissue. So in leukocyte adhesion deficiency, just like you say, the neutrophils can't get into the peripheral tissues and deal with cleanup. And so this kind of perpetuates a low-level inflammatory process that persists. And with LAD-1, these patients, once they've lost all of their teeth, actually fully resolve their gingival issues. And it's really that interface between the soft and hard tissues that causes so many problems for them early in life. And not that they don't have other issues, but the oral health aspect is by far a distinguishing feature for this group. But it's because some of the research that has been done in this area, we've learned so much about neutrophil trafficking into the oral tissues. And I'll stop in just a minute, Jonathan, but I just wanted to say that during a regular inflammatory event, we think of neutrophils as the cleanup crew, and when the cleanup is done, the neutrophils are gone. But in the oral tissues, the neutrophil is part of the healthy kind of stable mechanism of health, where the neutrophil is the surveillance cell, whereas in other tissues, it's often a dendritic cell or a macrophage. And in the oral cavity, it's just a whole different immune landscape, which is why I personally find it so fascinating. But I could go on, but I want to kind of really give this a bit of special treatment because it's the oral cavity and we're here at Let's Get Oral, but also because it is this nuanced conversation where historically we've thought of neutrophils as being a problem. And in the oral tissues, they're essential. And so people that have leukocyte adhesion deficiency that can't get the neutrophils to those tissues suffer an incredible amount. So I'll back off and let you go. Neutrophils.
No, Team Neutrophil over here, if you haven't learned already. And I think this is a good segue to kind of talk about the interplay, but getting more deeper, and also the role that oral bacteria have when it comes to inflation in the mouth. Would you like to
oh my gosh,
share a
I
little
can't
bit
stop
more
myself.
about...
I'm just going to roll right over everybody trying to talk about this. Apologies, everyone. I'm coming in hot.
Well, I'm excited. I definitely... how about you just tell us a little bit more about the role of oral bacteria, and particularly like some of either adhesins or endotoxins.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Endotoxin. That's going to be a thing. First, I will say that some of my thesis work centered around let's talk about a germ-free mouse. So a germ-free mouse is raised in a sterile environment and does not have any microbes. And they have to eat more food because they don't have a microbiome to kind of help process their food and avail nutrients that the microbes do for us in our guts. But in their mouth, they don't have any microbes. And so they actually have a much better oral health situation in that they can retain their bone. In these mice, when we're looking at their oral tissues, they have neutrophils there that seem very happy, and they have teeth and they have tissues and everything seems to be fine. And how the neutrophils are getting into those tissues is by really specific receptors and a cytokine called CXCL1. I'm not going to go into it, but when we added back microbes, they initiated a different cytokine to call in those neutrophils, and all of a sudden we have a slight change. So there's a cost to having this microbial relationship that comes with a little bit of inflammation that weathers over time. And overall, I would say that this microbiome relationship is genuinely favored, but it does come at a cost. And so I like to speak to that because I think it's an important feature. We're not going to go inflammation free. We have this ongoing relationship, but I think there are ways to nurture it successfully. So that's kind of what I love to talk about. the next thing is that microbiome is a mixture of both gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. And so when we talk about gram-negative and gram-positive, it was based on this really simple stain that that stained protein and didn't stain fat. Essentially, I'm trying to really make it simple here. And so the fatty gram-negatives didn't stain very well, but the gram-positives, who are more proteinaceous on their cell membrane, stained very dark purple. And so we could distinguish them under a microscope very easily. Gram-negative bacteria are often seen as growing better in conditions that don't have any oxygen. And so we expect to see them in the crevices or in our gum tissue. And then more superficially, we have our gram-positives. So that's just a really basic feature of oral health. And once you get deep pockets, you get a more robust community of gram-negatives, of course, because there's just more surface area for them to inhabit. But when there's inflammation there, those cytokines that are involved in inflammation become food for very specialized gram-negative bacteria that have evolved with us in that gingival crevice area. And so these gram-negative bacteria, what some of that fatty membrane is made up of endotoxin. And so I think the most famous endotoxin that we discuss in scientific literature is typically named LPS, lipopolysaccharide, and is associated with E. coli, which is part of our gut bacteria, although not a major member, just a minor member. And it is it can elicit a lot of inflammation if it's in the wrong place. So our tissues have evolved to signal to our cells that E. coli is in the wrong place because we need it to be in the right place. Other bacteria have evolved endotoxin that looks quite different from E. coli LPS, and they have again evolved with us and can shift their endotoxin phenotype to signal differently to our cells and communicate. So under inflammatory conditions, it's been shown that our oral gram-negative bacteria can signal to our immune system very differently. One of the things that I've written about in the past is how that type of endotoxin might influence our trained innate immunity. And I think this is a really cool area that we're deep into exploration. We know very little, and there's a lot to be done. But there are, like GSK has an adjuvant, which is made up of a little piece of this endotoxin that is used in vaccines, just a couple in market. And so what its role is to signal to the immune system to say, hey, come here, look at this thing, and then remember it, and then act on it if you see it in the future. And so what this suggests is that these endotoxins can actually show our immune system what to pay attention to. So in something like periodontal disease, where you have inflammation and those cytokines are becoming food for the gram-negative bacteria in your gingival crevice, the endotoxin shifts and there's a different communication, a different conversation happening between the bacteria and our immune cells. And so this can really alter your immune landscape and potentially be one of the reasons why we see so many comorbidities occur with periodontal disease. So
Wow.
So bringing it back to that systemic link between cardiovascular disease, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and periodontal disease, there's this kind of back and forth. You can have a population of people who are both good and bad at oral hygiene. And we've seen in those populations over a time the people who have poor oral hygiene start to develop systemic diseases like cardiovascular disease, for example, and this has been shown. Conversely, those people that have genetic predispositions or problems with cardiovascular disease and rheumatoid arthritis can start to develop periodontal disease. So there's this like two-way street where inflammation from either one side or the other can kind of develop more globally. And Haji Shingalis out of University of Pennsylvania does a really nice discussion on this topic in his paper. It's a maladaptive trained immunity paper linking periodontal disease with inflammatory comorbidities, where he really gives a lot of lip service to this potential of trained innate immunity being one of the pieces linking periodontal disease with these comorbidities. So I just think that there's so much to dig into. But now that we have a little bit of an idea where we know that inflammation is the food that allows that gram-negative population of oral bacteria to thrive and have this very different conversation with ourselves, how can we treat that inflammation so we're basically starving out those bacteria and kind of whipping them back into their minor roles and having a better conversation with them generally to kind of mitigate some of the damage that comes from that global chronic inflammatory process. One of the pieces that I think is interesting, and I hope, Jonathan, you can talk to this, but in elite athletes, there's a level of tissue repair and inflammation that is ongoing. We talked to Dr. Glogauer in the last episode about how potentially having food nonstop and not doing intermittent fasting can elicit a leaky gut situation, and that elite athletes might be in this realm of constant tissue repair that kind of allows this leaky gut thing to occur for them too, but they end up having some bad oral health situations. And I think of them as like the most fit of our species, right? So like, how do we stop this train of inflammation? How can we starve out the bacteria that are causing so many problems and having these maladaptive responses and altering our innate immune conversations? How do we do this?
Yes, the way athletes have been just conditioned when it comes to with technology and everything and monitoring health and how we evaluate health and fitness. It's amazing how long we've neglected the mouth, particularly, in as a space for evaluating their ability to perform long term. And if you take a step back and look at the demands nutritionally, particularly when it comes to high-performing athletes or those who just need to have a higher caloric intake, they're usually taking that in forms of Gatorade. these electrolyte, like their juices, blends, etc., that usually have both a high sugar load and also taken at a high frequency. Imagine, athletes that have 2-a-days or are highly aerobic and they're in the gym and running in the track field, et cetera. And then also the frequency of their diet in and of itself that really doesn't allow them to do intermittent fasting. It really is not all that surprising when you look at the data coming out of surveilling reports looking at professional athletes. One particular group that's done a lot of work in this space comes from the Centre of London over in the UK, who's done a lot of studies over the years looking particularly at soccer players and the Premier League and the other lower level leagues such as the champions and whatnot. And what they were able to observe and determine from understanding their oral care behaviors and habits was, even though they tend to generally have quote unquote positive oral care or hygiene, they actually had really poor outcomes due to the demands and the programs of food intake, electrolyte replenishing, et cetera, to allow them to continue performing the way that they can at a high and competitive level. And so this is a particularly interesting space for researchers, and now especially for athletes, now that we understand, hey, if we are having caries or systemic inflammation in the mouth that is linked to your cardiovascular health and other parts of your well-being, that can directly and indirectly affect their ability to perform long term. And so I'm glad that researchers are, not just for athletes, but especially for them, wanting to take a better look at this space and hopefully come up with alternative programs, or at least recalibrate their training and nutritional programs to be able to mitigate some of those poor oral care outcomes.
Yeah, you bring up diet. I love to talk about diet because it's such a big issue that we have had a hard time controlling for. We can talk all day about, food products and sugar, but at the end of the day, everybody is like in a hurry and, just grabs whatever they can to get by. And it's hard to take a moment and maybe brush your teeth to just remove the damage done, or go for something that's not going to cause so many problems. But I do want to say that the mouse research in this area has been challenging with regard to periodontal disease and downstream comorbidities, because when we do periodontal research, we oftentimes will add bacteria or ligature or something to induce a periodontal insult. But the Western fatty diet is enough. That's enough to give a mouse periodontal disease, cardiovascular disease, rheumatoid arthritis. It's enough to cause obesity in mice. It's enough. So we don't know if the perio disease comes first for these animals, and then gut dysbiosis and leaky gut and metabolic disorders, or if the obesity comes first and then metabolic disease and then perio. But there's this like interrelationship that, again, I'm going to speak to the neutrophils, because they are coming from your bone marrow. They move through your vasculature and then into the peripheral tissues, mainly your mucosal tissues. And when they're surveilling, if there's an inflammatory process like rheumatoid arthritis, like cardiovascular disease, like metabolic endotoxemia, the neutrophils that are moving through your vasculature are exposed to these inflammatory cytokines. Often endotoxin is there when you have metabolic disorders, and they can become primed and ready to take on the world, as far as like creating even more inflammation and exacerbating what is already a chronic situation. So when they get to the mucosal tissues to do their surveillance, they're already hot, they're on fire. And when you have some level of periodontal disease or gingivitis or some sort of insult in your oral tissues and these neutrophils come, they're gonna cause a lot more problems, because they're already kind of primed, mad, if you will, ticked off at the world and ready to take it on. And so they come in screaming, and they create a lot of additional inflammation. And so how do we get this back? I like to talk about anti-inflammatory therapeutics, because I feel like that's an opportunity that is underutilized. But when you go to the anti-inflammatory research, it's it's not as compelling. So, for example, if you do the NSAIDs route, there's a whole Cochrane review that is fairly recent that looks at NSAIDs in periodontal treatment and says it's lackluster. There's no real advantage to using NSAIDs in periodontal treatment. Aspirin, however, does look pretty promising. There's another review out for that, for using aspirin in periodontal improvement. There is a lot in personalized medicine discussion around the specialized pro-resolving mediator supplements. They're derived from fish oil, and they are these enzymatically derived mediators that are from essential oils, and they act as immunoresolvents, which it's basically a cute word for like calming down the immune system naturally. And I started to take some because I was a little horrified at the NSAIDs research, which NSAIDs are provocative. They turn off the inflammation cycle very well, but what they also do is they interrupt the wound healing process. So your wound healing doesn't occur very well, or it's stunted. And so, yes, you're turning off the pain, but you're not able to resolve the issue. And so you kind of propagate the problem by using NSAIDs. So you want something that's going to help you with the wound healing as well. And I think that that's possibly why they're not working very well in periodontal treatment, because you need that wound repair to come clean up. So these specialized pro-resolving mediators have been supported as an anti-inflammatory supplement that people like Sarah Gottfried, who is doing a lot of personalized medicine, they're recommending these pro-resolving mediators as a way to treat acute inflammation. And interestingly, the Forsyth Institute up in Boston or Cambridge or on the river, it's on the river, so I don't want to pigeonhole them into one side or the other. I know there's favorites. I know it's political. I'm not going to say anymore. But anyway, I was able to work with the Van Dyke Lab for a moment for my thesis project, and they've been working on Resolven E1 for a very long time. They've done some really great research, Hatice and Alp, and Marcelo Freya as well, all working on Resolven E1 in various forms of periodontal treatment, lung cancer, diabetes. It's really, there's some provocative research, but I also love the idea that you can take something like it's essentially really fancy fish oils to dampen inflammation in general. So I love that story, but I don't know that it's going to solve our Western diet situation. I think that that's going to take a lot more work, unfortunately. The other thing I will say about inflammation and things we can do is taking on oral hygiene products. This is a secret passion of mine, or maybe not so secret. But skincare for the last 20 years has been going through an overhaul where we have identified fragrances and irritants in the ingredient profiles and have really cleaned them out, recognizing that we need an oral or a skin microbiome, and we don't want to dry out our tissues and cause barrier malfunctions. So when you dry out the skin, obviously you're more susceptible to barrier function loss. And so we need these gentle products. Well, similarly, I think we need some more gentle products for our mucosal mouth tissues, because our current approach is still from the 1950s, which is to like really gut the microbiome, because we know they are a problem. And yes, they're a problem, but really only when there's inflammation. So how do we create this balance And I think that oral hygiene needs to go through a similar kind of revival, identifying irritants like SLS or stannous fluoride. Not that fluoride's bad, but stannous can be really abusive for some people. Not every one of us has this durable skin quality that allows us to use just anything. Like I can't even wear metal earrings anymore. I have to, I have to, do clip-ons or get creative because some of us are more sensitive than others. And so the current oral care products are still pretty abusive with irritants and flavors that can potentially exacerbate an underlying problem. And so I think that's an opportunity space that I'd like to see a lot more attention. And then there's that intermittent fasting. There are no good research articles that I found. A couple of reviews talking about how it could be favorable for periodontal disease, but generally, like Dr. Glogauer said on our last episode, that intermittent fasting, it basically allows the mucosal tissues through the whole top to bottom to kind of have a rest. And you're not feeding the microbiome. They're not flourishing. Your tissues are having a moment to have a nice barrier function. And so you're not in this active immune insult. When you eat, you're blowing out the microbiome top to bottom, and your immune system has to deal with it. And so eating in itself is a little inflammatory. So intermittent fasting does look like a provocative option, but I don't know how many of us want to pause on our food, because I know I'm a big foodie, so it gets in the way sometimes. And that Kona barbecue is going to kill me.
Oh yes, I actually do practice intermittent fasting myself, but that has been on pause on this trip.
You can only do so much,
for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Right, but to counteract that, in addition to keeping up with my oral hygiene, another space or opportunity for being able to potentially maintain and control inflammation in the mouth could be through moderate exercise, which might seem contradictory to when we were talking about how relatively poor oral health can be for elite athletes. But since most of us are not elite athletes and probably don't train like elite athletes, it's amazing how far a little exercise can go for being able to maintain a relative homeostasis at the inflammatory level.
I will.
So we talked about. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
And I think what's linked to that exercise part is how that helps us manage our hunger and therefore our diet accordingly. And so I would be curious to see over time if there were more studies that looked at both toggling exercise and diet/fasting, and how those in combination or in isolation can impact oral health for different demographics accordingly.
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think we're just starting to kind of get a handle on the science of it. But nutritional dietary research is so often a challenge in the research setting, because you have to trust people or you have to have them sequestered, and those are both problematic. So, because
yes.
You could go to prison populations, but that has its own ethical issue. And then, and then trusting people, that historically hasn't gone well. So, but here's a personal story that happened to me recently. I had a bout of diverticulitis, and it was unpleasant. I don't recommend it. Nobody go out and get diverticulitis. I don't. It's terrible. So obviously I ended up in the hospital because I was hurting. And one of the tells were my kids saying that I had terrible breath, which was embarrassing for me, given my focus and expertise. But also, I did feel like globally I had an enhanced kind of inflammatory profile. And I felt like all of a sudden, all the things that I was doing with my life and trying to, eat healthy was just going sideways. And I was able to get it kind of back, rein it back pretty swiftly. Thank goodness. I haven't had an issue since. But just in that moment, having everything kind of blow up and feeling really out of control and not knowing where to go for relief, I think that a lot of people could easily be really frustrated in a moment where, how much do I have to really change my entire life to get a grip on what is happening with my body? And I don't think any of us have really great answers, but it is multifactorial. And so taking a handful approach is probably all we have right now. A little bit of exercise, a little bit of fasting, a lot of healthy food, and really looking carefully at what you're putting in and on your body as far as a product, I think are all important pieces to the inflammation story.
Agreed. We might sound like a broken record over time, but I won't be surprised if we recommend high fiber, natural / fruit diets and exercise at some point of each episode. But I do want to say that because it does kind of reinforce how amazing these things, if you can control them, can go a long way with some of these either superficial or to super systemic conditions that impact our oral health and also our just overall well-being.
Yes, absolutely. So hopefully your mouth is not on fire and that you can drink that Kona coffee and eat that barbecue and then come back and do some intermittent fasting together.
I will definitely need to do some intermittent fasting after this trip. Well, as always, Camille, this was a lot of fun. Thank you for diving in on this topic. I think it was a nice segue and transition from our last few episodes talking about saliva and our interview with Dr. Glogauer. And I look forward to exploring this topic in more detail in the future.
Yes, we will always be touching back on inflammation because it's such a big piece of oral health. But I'm hoping that our next meandering will bring us to the aesthetic space. So let's talk about how our smile is important in life. That's going to come up.
I look forward to it.
Anyway, I'm smiling at you in Hawaii. Oh, really me. All right. Well, we love you guys. Thank you for listening at Let's Get Oral.
Of course. It's just always a pleasure. And keep smiling.
Woo. Ciao.
Let's get oral.
Hey there, listener. If you made it this far, we want to genuinely thank you for listening to Let's Get Oral and giving us a chance. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite streaming platform, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else, and please share this widely with your friends, family, and coworkers. And if you haven't listened to our previous episodes, we highly recommend you check some of those in our catalog, such as the one we most recently published with Dr. Jonathan focus on the role aging and oral health play with each other. Until next time, keep smiling.